White Russians was a term used to designate all the Russians who were opposed to the Bolshevik Revolution spearheaded by Lenin. The Bolshevik had adopted the color as red, and so by opposition to the red, white.
There also, the Imperial Russian flag was white and with a double-headed eagle. That was the Tsar's flag.
My father was an officer in a Russian White Army during the Tsar of Nicholas II. Revolution came to Russia. He was fighting, but they lost. So he and a part of his army went to the east of Russia and then into the China.
Shanghai at the time was labeled as a symbol of Western capitalist decadence. And culturally speaking, Mao Zedong was quite keen to sort of eradicate this inheritance from the past. In that course, at the eve of the entry of the Mao Zedong Red Army into Shanghai, these people were not going to be able to live peacefully under this regime.
We heard how terrible it was for the White Russians. They were taking them to Soviet Russia, and some of them, like in the case of one of my uncles, he was shot. So when we heard that the communists are coming, straight away we got to go, leave everything.
And that's it. Whether you like it or not, you know we're going.
And Mr. Bologov was in charge of the Russian Immigrant Association.
Bologov, I understand, was a very flamboyant ex-Tsarist officer. And he quickly took upon himself to organize the people.
None of us knew where would we end up and what our life would be. Like it was all uncertain.
And this is when all these people who were there regrouped, so to speak, and they, okay, where do we go next? These people had no consular representation. They had no one to turn to. And as we've seen, various communities among them, not only Russian. So it was not a monolithic bloc.
They were all Russian speaking, they were culturally Russian, but my goodness, we had Ukrainians, we had Estonians, we had Jews, we had Gypsies.
Tartar from Crimea, Latvians.
There were also some Armenians and Georgians.
Czech, Poles, Hungarians.
We even had one family of Hindus.
Nonetheless, the IRO was approached by the leader of the so-called White Russian, Colonel Borokov, saying, "Save us." So the IRO launched an appeal, and the countries were busy with their own reconstruction. None of them replied to the call of IRO. Well, in this very, very remote corner of Asia, the only country who replied to the call of IRO was the Philippines. Barely independent, but also reconstructing the country, which has suffered terrible devastation. Nonetheless, President Quirino put an act on the table and said, we Philippines will accept these people. To appreciate the political significance of such an act by the Philippines under the leadership of President Quirino, who grant asylum to a group of people in need of international protection. That is remarkable.
I left Shanghai with Mom on the 26th of February in 49, and I don't know how many days it took on board the ship, probably about 6 days or so.
Itatay kuan man ko dan newspaper, makan ikunot mga Rusya na Tubabao. Pag-abusin mangos kasimana, pinikita manggudamon ang barko na kadalidamon ni manikanik. Nga, targa na adto ng mga Rusyan. Hapot at ayra, tika ng barko madabit sa kamparang, ang bards ni Jose Ulanda.
Loaded us up on a PAL flight, and luckily enough, I got a seat by the window. Oh my Lord, they had the blue ocean, they had the little islands, they had the palm trees sticking out. I mean, it was great.
And the scenery, to see those islands, some waters looked purple, some waters looked pink because the sun was coming up, and reflection, and it was such a gorgeous, extremely gorgeous sight.
In a very pragmatic Filipino spirit, the decision makers at the time said, oh, sige, we've got the old hospital structure on the island of Tubabao, which was built by the Americans for the landing operations. Well, instead of having the structure go to waste, we might as well recycle it into a refugee camp.
But unfortunately, when the White Russians arrived in Giwan, and particularly in Tubabao Island, nothing was left except for some pavements.
Noon, marami ng damo, diri, mga kuya postura.
Of course, it was more difficult, you know, because the living conditions in the tent, and they gave us all the army cots, you know, to sleep on. Quite a shock after living so many years in the cities, you know, you had to come and live in tents, you know, in the middle of nowhere.
It was a shock because we didn't know what to expect, especially these people that arrived 2 weeks before. In 2 weeks, you see somebody in shorts and some of them even no shoes at all. I was like, oh, what's happening?
But, you know, they didn't wait passively to say, we're waiting for a refugee camp for us. So they built it themselves. Clearing up the bushes, the jungles, leveling the ground, and so on, with support from Filipino communities around them, support from the Philippine government.
When we got to the tent, the grass was up to your knees, so you had to pull out all this so that you could put the cot into the place and put your belongings in.
My father and I went into the jungle and cut some reeds, and we built a fence around our tent. Privacy.
When you need to do things, you find a way.
No big deal, no. There are a lot worse things in this world, you know.
Soon we got used to it.
We were happy that we were safe.
When you think about it, they lived in Russia and then they moved to China and they had already lived there for 25 years or more. And then they had to be uprooted again. And here they were living on an island where they didn't know, is this going to be the rest of our life or what's going to be the next step? I think irrespective of that, they were happy, positive, looking forward people.
As my father always said, as long as you have life. That's what I learned.
You had to get accustomed to a different kind of
the act that President Quirino opposed through an agreement with the International Refugee Organization, said, look, we can accept them. In exchange, IRO, please help us to find the durable solution to the plight of these refugees, which was done through advocacy and the work done by IRO with Canada, Australia, United States, France, Belgium, Germany, Argentina, Paraguay, Santo Domingo, a few other countries. Now, first difficulty was the fact that the major resettlement instrument which existed within the arsenal of law in the United States, the Displaced Person Act, was outdated. For instance, prohibited persons who came from countries who were deemed as unfriendly to the United States to be resettled. So, white Russians were technically, from a nationality point of view, were coming from Russia. So therefore, in the beginning, they were not eligible for resettlement.
They didn't want to accept us because we were not under the GP bill.
That's right. Many other countries, nobody wants a bunch of 6,000 Russians.
And St. John, he actually left Tubabao, went to America, and he prayed on the steps of Congress.
And literally sat on the steps till they would hear him.
Until somebody noticed him from the American Congress and said, what are you doing here? And that's when he appealed to the American Congress to allow the white Russians to migrate to America.
Senator Nolan arrived at the camp in November of 1949, and he gave promises that people can actually enter the United States of America through the Displaced Persons Bill. Generally, they were very happy that Senator Nolan was there and that he was actually looking into taking them in. So it was somehow a vision of hope for them.
There were quite a few artists there, and they used to regularly go and paint. My uncle painted over 200 paintings.
Because my father was a doctor, he was allowed to visit the White Russian camp in Tubabao. And through his work with the White Russians, he invited some people that he knew on the camp over to our house. They used to come to the house once or twice a month on a weekend. Since a lot of the people in the camp had some kind of ability to do some crafts, I remember that some women used to sell flowers to some people in Giwan. As one of the ways of earning some money, they did this.
Pag nagkakasalubong kami, galing ako sa eskwelahan, sasabihin sa akin, Dabi Regine, sasabihin ko yan, give me bread, I will give you flower. Yes, 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 sabi nila. Katima, kumukuha ako ng bulaklak ng ang tawag dito, laglag. Yan ang binibigay ko. Binibigyan ako ng malalaking American bread. Pag uuwi ko, mayroon dara akong American bread.
I was a member of the parish choir. Mr. Donayu, who was the finance officer of the ARO, he got interested. So we were invited to have our rehearsals in Tubabao, where the White Russians were staying. Mr. Stenberg, a White Russian, was our organ player. He was a great pianist.
There were about 50 people who were musicians. I know that there was one piano teacher who had students in Guyuan.
Nasa katlong baitan ako ng babang paaralan nang mag-aral ako ng piano sa kay Professor Walter, isang Russian refugee. Bawat leksyon, 1 oras, 5 piso ang bayad sa kanya.
and everybody put in this salary into a special fund, and in our district, they all agree to use it to make the food a little more palatable.
Kasi hindi naman mga sanay kumain ng isda siguro yung mga Rosso. Kaya may rasyon sila every other day ng baka. Ng mga negosyante dito, isa na yung ama ko na naghahatid sa Tubabao ng baka. Dahil sa siya ang nagrarasyon ng baka sa mga Russian refugee, nakilala niya si Professor Walter na marunong magtugtog. Kaya pinapag-aral kami.
Madame Karamsin was the third piano teacher that I had in G1 who taught me a lot. She was the one who taught me more about piano than anybody else. I learned from them that they were from past nobility and so on and so forth. Her husband was a great artist. He did painting and metal crafting. They always came whenever we had parties in the house, we had picnics. In fact, they were almost part of the family for us. And when I had my 12th birthday, she decided to give me as a gift, wrapped up in a little handkerchief because she couldn't afford anything else to wrap it up in, was a ring, pearl ring that she had owned since she was a young lady from Russia, which I kept for many years. And this was the type of relationship that we had with these white Russians.
During our graduation, Mr. Stenberg also accompanied our graduation song. We also invited some
destroyed the bridge constructed by the Americans, connecting Giwan and Tubabao Island, and also the tents. Some of them got sick after the typhoon, and they said it was really a difficult life. They had no choice. They had to be there, and they had to survive.
They had to be relocated. So at first, they were sent to Tacloban City, but they were sent back to Giwan. So they had to be built again.
And that's how resilient they are.
The best part about that were the memories of togetherness. It was a very important feeling to be having this togetherness, and we are unit, and we got to fight it and enjoy the life meanwhile.
Towards the end, some of them migrated to South America, including Argentina, Paraguay.
Santo Domingo, but also Germany, Belgium. France had the particularity towards the end to say all the woman-headed households with patients who were suffering from tuberculosis would be accepted by France.
And the able-bodied men went to Sydney, and then by 1950, the amendments to the bill was finally passed. So by 1951, Nolan's promise finally materialized, and finally the people were able to live their new life in the United States of America.
Indeed, on the ship that we came on here, the Marine Jumper, we disembarked in Sydney whilst others continued on to Uruguay and so on, South America.
We were glad we were leaving and finally going someplace where we're going to settle down. But on the other hand, we didn't know, well, when are we going to meet again, Of course, I missed a lot of friends.
Even if they were young at that time, they understood what it meant for someone like President Quirino to save their lives. So they tell it to their children and their children's children. And even to this day, they're very, very grateful. He was a savior for them, a hero for them.
The whole Russian community in Tubabao owes tremendous thanks to President Quirino.
I would like to thank him for letting us spend time in the Philippines.
Thank you for them to give us a place to stay.
I'm grateful for the experience. I'm grateful to the Philippine people. And there's lots of good things and lots of bad things, but we persevered.
It was better than any pirate movie I've ever seen before,
When you're young, you don't think of the rest of your life. You just live everything's beautiful, sunshine, moonlight. But as you grow older and you begin to reminisce about your life, and that gene, that really did come, it changed everybody's life. That's my feeling toward the Philippines.
you.